Chains, Chapter 34. I had no time to ponder Curzon's fate. Madam commanded that supper be thrown to celebrate the capture of Fort Washington, complete with turtle soup. The house fair exploded with dust and activity. The junior officers cleared out their cots, clothing, and maps from the second-floor drawing room so we could scrub and polish it from ceiling to floor. The kitchen hearth was crowded with irons heating to press the tablecloths and serviettes. Madam hired a cook from the city tavern to prepare the meal. Folks said he had a way with turtles. She then chose the prettiest of soldier wives to wait the tables. The ugly ones and Sarah with her big belly were to stay in the kitchen and assist the cook and wash up. My job was to ferry the food up the stairs and the dirty crockery down. The food began arriving long before sunup, packed in crates and hauled by sleepy-eyed boys. 3 turtles, each the size of a footstool, came in wooden pen. The sound of their flippers scratching made Sarah yelp in fright. 2 of the turtles kept their heads tight against their shells. The third stretched out its neck and watched the commotion with wet, solemn eyes. While we scurried to finish the house, the cook butchered the turtles and plucked the pheasants. The hairdresser arrived to tend to Madam. He spent hours applying pomatum wax, patting, and lengths of brick-colored hair to fashion a high roll on Madam's head. The hair swept off her brow and soared into the air like a wave curling before a ship's prow. I thought the wave might crumble, but Madam didn't ask my opinion. She wanted a pot of hot chocolate made with 2 handfuls of sugar, which was a shocking amount. Sarah and the cook were exchanging heated words in the kitchen. Empty turtle shells stood drying in the corner. The cook's assistant stirred the thick soup bubbling over the fire. I grabbed the chocolate pot and left, not wanting to see what became of those poor turtles' heads. As I served the hot chocolate and tidied the chamber, Madam rubbed her face with a Venetian Bloomwater beauty wash to remove the wrinkles. After that came the layer of Molinoxen's Italian paste to make her skin as white as bleached linen. It made her resemble a corpse. And then, the final triumph. She used a tiny brush to paint thin lines of glue above each eye. Madam opened an envelope and shook out 2 gray strips of mouse fur, each cut into an arc. Leaning towards the mirror, she glued the mouse fur onto her own eyebrows, making them bushy and as thick as fashion required. In truth, she looked like a woman with 2 lumps of mouse fur stuck to her face. A delicate bell sounded overhead, Lady Seymour summoning help. "The guest will be arriving soon," Madam said, admiring her reflection. "Aunt Seymour wishes to be seated in advance of them. You may assist her." After I helped the lady limp from the chamber to her place near the head of the long table, I placed a foot warmer filled with hot coals under her chair and spread a woolen blanket across her lap. She thanked me kindly and looked about. "When I was young, we dined like this every night," she said with a sigh. I could scarce credit it. The table was covered by the finest tablecloth I had ever seen. Each place had china plates, crystal glasses, and ivory-handled knives and forks. Candles were positioned every 3 handles, salt cellars, each with a tiny spoon, and pepper mills were set in arm's reach of each plate. Smaller tables and sideboards were positioned at the edges of the room to hold trays and dishes, and one table was covered with wine bottles. Candlelight reflected back and back again into the polished mirrors that hung from the walls. I caught a glimpse in the hearth mirror of a girl with a mark on her cheek that trumpeted her shame. I quickly turned my eyes away. There was a heavy knock on the front door. "It begins," Lady Seymour said. "Go below, child." I set the tray loaded with turtle soup bowls on the table by the door. 3 more trays needed to be brought up the stairs, but I allowed myself a quick peek at the company before I fetched them. The table was crowded with officers wearing splendid uniforms and perfectly powdered wigs, along with several of Master Lockton's business companions. Lockton wore a cardinal red satin waistcoat, black satin coat and breeches, and shoes with silver buckles. The new clothes could not hide the fact that the master was grinding himself down with work. Long hours serving the British commandant had melted off the fat from his second and third chins and created heavy black circles under his eyes. But his bags of gold grew fatter, and that's what he cared about the most. Madam reigned over her into the table with occasional flutter of her fan, the wave of her hair, above her brow threatened to crash at any moment. Lady Seymour, the only other woman present, looked like an elegant spider wrapped in her black lace shawl. Her eyes were lively in the candlelight, and her cheeks had color in them for the first time in weeks. The officer next to her was the size and shape of Edward, the shaggy bull who lived down the road from us in Rhode Island. The man didn't have a ring in his nose, but he laughed with an impatient snorting sound. I hurried up and down the stairs with the remaining trays of soup, then roasted tongue and mushrooms. The serving girl cut the meat on Lady Seymour's plate before setting it down so that the weakness of her arm wouldn't hinder her. The younger soldier, who was appointed wine steward, danced around the backs of the guests, keeping their glasses full. The conversating flowed as fast as the wine, the taking of Fort Washington, news from London, plans for a fox hunt. At this last, the officer joked that the next fox would be a tall sort from Virginia by the name of George Washington. That caused hearty laughter all around and glasses raised. A serving girl hissed at me to get back to the kitchen. When I entered the room a half hour later, my arms shook under the weight of the tray. The cook had prepared enough food to feed a battalion. Pheasant stuffed with figs, stewed oysters, potted larks, greens cooked with bacon, pickled watermelon rind, and buttered parsnips. The pheasant smelled good. I had hopes that some might find its way into the scrap bucket. By the time I lugged the dessert tray, rice pudding, lemon biscuits, 2 cream pear tarts, and an iced cake, the fire was blazing and the room was much warmer. Lockton had freed up the top buttons of his waistcoat, and 2 of the officers had loosened their lace neckcloths. The heat had softened the glue on Madame's left mousy eyebrow, and it had begun to free itself from her face. She did not notice this. The serving girls and the wine steward watched the progress of the eyebrow and fought to keep smiles from their faces. The voices of the men were loud and booming, as if the wine they drank affected their hearing. I handed a plate of tart to one of the serving women, who carried it to the table and set it in front of Colonel Hawkins. How many rebel prisoners did your men bag, Colonel?" Master Lockton asked. I passed another dish of tart. The colonel shook his head. "Near 3,000 of the devils. Wish we could have shot 'em all." My hand shook as I reached for the third. "Why so?" Lockton asked. "We have no place for them." The colonel pushed the tart to the side and reached into the bowl of shelled almonds in the middle of the table. He tossed a few into his mouth and crunched loudly. "I thought you were using the Bridewell," Lockton said. "That should provide ample space." The colonel snorted and shook his head. "The prison is so stuffed the walls are ready to burst. We've had to pack them into sugar houses and confiscated churches, too." He reached for more nuts. "It's a right nuisance. Never thought we'd have so many." I'd say I would say so. Many prisoners are a badge of honor for your men and the king," Lockton said. The colonel raised his eyebrow. "We do not need a badge of honor. We need a decent plague to take them off our hands." The men around the table chuckled. "The expense of feeding them will be staggering." The rebels planted the seeds of war. Now let them enjoy their harvest. Lockton ate a forkful of tart. Force the local patriots to feed them. "Shoot 'em, I say," growled the man who looked like Edward the Bull. "Course, then we'd have to dispose of the bodies. Messy work, that." "Waste of ammunition," the colonel said, "and some members of Parliament would fuss like wet hens. No, I predict a cold winter will dispatch most of them in the natural way." Lady Seymour spoke up. "What if the rebels decide that a turnabout is fair play? We need to care for them so they do not harm their British captives." "With all due respect, ma'am," the man said with a smile, "the rebels would first have to capture a prisoner. Given their blunders, that's an unlikely prospect." Lady Seymour nodded gravely. "What of the prisoners they took after their victory at Breed's Hill?" The table fell very still after that. Talking about what happened at Breed's Hill in Boston was as rude as stating Madame's false eyebrow was about to fall off. But Lady Seymour was wealthy, elderly widow of a British lord, incapable of social air, so we all pretended she hadn't said a word. Several men cleared their throats and reached for their wine. Madame lifted her goblet. "I am told that there are plans to reopen the John Street Theater," she said loudly. "This heralds a return to civilization and order." Her eyebrow flopped into the rice pudding. The man seated next to her coughed loudly into his napkin, and the wine steward's face turned the color of plum, and the serving girl bit down on her lip to prevent a laugh. Madame avoided looking at her pudding. "A toast," she said in a wobbling voice. "A toast to civilization," Lockton added. "I've heard plans for a cricket club, too." As the men roared in approval, I carried the tray loaded with dirty supper dishes down the stairs. On my return trip upstairs, I carried 2 pots of coffee. My trips up and down the stairs continued until my knees threatened to fold up and quit, bringing dishes down, carrying more delicacies and hot drinks up. Down, up, 100 miles of stairs in one night. As the candles guttered out and were replaced with new, Madame and Lady Seymour retired to their bedchambers, and the Locktons' business companions left to play billiards at the King's Head Tavern. The officers requested more coffee, lit their pipes, and unrolled their maps across the tablecloth, stained now with splashes of turtle soup, butter, wine, and candle wax. The serving girls moved down to the kitchen, where the kettles of water were put on to boil for washing of the dishes. The cook was long departed, and Sarah dozed in a kitchen chair, her swollen feet propped up on a pillow. I picked up an enormous bowl of food scraps and headed out the back door. Miss Mary Finch always mixed table scraps with muck and spread the smelly mess on her garden come spring, but the Locktons weren't much for growing things, not when the markets were so close to hand. Scraps were dumped down the privy. I closed the door behind me and stopped. The cold air took my breath away. The sky was a black curtain, the stars, ice chips, whittled like an old knife. I wrapped my shawl tighter across my shoulders and pulled it high to protect my neck. Through the kitchen window, I could see 2 of the women squabbling about who would wash and who would dry. The second-floor window glowed with candlelight shadowed by the shapes of officers circling around the map. I shuddered, and my teeth banged together. Water would turn solid tonight. It was a bad night to be without a blanket. Would they truly allow the prisoners to freeze to death? The soldier wives stopped arguing. The men lit fresh candles, and the stars wheeled above me, and inside, deep inside, something turned. I couldn't name it or recognize its form. I drew in a cold breath and blew it skyward. The air came from out of me in the shape of a cloud, and it drifted above the rooftop and dissolved into the stars. Would they let him starve? The stars said not a word. The back door banged open and I jumped. "Don't tarry," Sarah said. "You need to dry the last of them glasses before you lay yourself to sleep." "Yes, ma'am, as soon as I finish this." I quickly carried the scrap bowl out to the yard, walking past the privy all the way back to the stable wall where a shaggy holly bush grew. I glanced quick at the house to make sure no one was watching. Then I pulled aside the prickly branches of the bush and set the bowl down within it. I covered the bowl with my apron, and on my way back to the house I loaded my arms with firewood. I doubted she noticed that I left the bowl outside, not with me bringing in extra wood. I took a deep breath of frozen air before I opened the door, confused that I should be so awake after such a long day. I frowned as my thoughts tumbled and multiplied. I have been invaded. A dim plan had hatched itself in my brain pan without my consent, and I did not much like it.